First, she went missing overseas. Then, her husband lied to the authorities. Now, he's charged with her murder. We're of course talking about the case of Anna Knezevich, the American national who vanished without a trace while living in Spain. Almost right away, the investigation pointed to her estranged husband, David. Nearly 1 year after her disappearance, he now faces federal charges in her murder. I'm Gillespie, and this is Law&Crime News. We've been keeping tabs on the story of Anna Knezevich for nearly 1 year now, after she was last seen back in February. The case captivated the world when this beautiful, vibrant woman went missing during a time when she was supposed to be regaining her independence. Here's some background. 40-year-old Anna Knezevich is originally from Colombia, but also was an American citizen who was based in Florida. At the time of her disappearance, she was living in Madrid, Spain, though, as she was in the midst of a messy divorce with her husband, 36-year-old David Knezevich. The pair were married for 13 years, and prosecutors say David didn't want to split up his massive savings account if their divorce was finalized. And we're talking a substantial amount of money here. Around the time of her disappearance, David received a $6 million paycheck after selling some homes in southern Florida. But let's get into the details of Anna's disappearance. She was last seen on February 2nd at her apartment in Madrid. She spoke with a friend on the phone late that night, and that was the last time anyone for sure heard from her. The next day, on February 3rd, two of Anna's friends received a weird message coming from Anna's phone. One of those friends was Sana Ramo.
I spoke to her that Friday, and then the next day, on the 3rd in the afternoon, I received those very strange messages that she had met a man on the street and she was going to go to his summer house, and none of it made sense.
Sana has been pretty outspoken since Anna disappeared, even appearing on our show multiple times. She also shared a screenshot of that message she received from Anna's phone after she went missing. The text reads in part, quote, "I met someone wonderful. He has a summer house about 2 hours from Madrid. We're going there now, and I will spend a few days there. Signal is spotty. I'll call you when I get back." Sana says this seemed off to her. She had plans to meet up with Anna just a few days after this, and it was really out of character for Anna to cancel plans like that. So on February 4th, a wellness check was performed at Anna's Madrid apartment, but firefighters came up empty-handed. She wasn't in the apartment, and it had been locked from the outside. Even though everything appeared to be in place at Anna's apartment, Spanish investigators still felt something was off and soon found some suspicious activity from the night she was last seen. That's the same night a person wearing a helmet is caught on security camera video near her apartment. This person also spray paints the lens to cover it up. The U.S. Attorney's Office has since released a picture of this showing the suspect, and they say it's David Knezevich, her estranged husband. They also say this same person, believed to be David, is caught on other security camera video too, buying duct tape and the same brand of paint used to cover up those cameras. Hey, a lot of you watching this might be business owners or even thinking about starting your own side hustle. I have to introduce you to our sponsor, Odoo. It's a free all-in-one business management software with tools to help you run your business. So I'm a dog owner, and I built my sweet boy Dash his own website using Odoo's website builder. It literally took minutes thanks to Odoo's easy tools like AI copywriting and drag and drop features. 5 minutes later, and boom, we now have dashthedog.com. All I can say is thanks to Odoo for sponsoring our videos and giving Dash the 15 minutes of fame he deserves. You can start building your site right now and get a free domain for the first year with our link, odoo.com/lcnews4. Use it to try Odoo for free. In the days after Anna's disappearance, David told authorities he was in his home country of Serbia when she was last seen. But he told a different story to Sana, saying he was in Fort Lauderdale that day. His phone told a different story than that because it pinged in Madrid the last day Anna was seen. There's more incriminating evidence against David too. The feds say it was David who wrote up the strange text from Anna's phone that was sent to her friends and family. Allegedly, David met a Colombian woman on a dating app and asked her to translate the message to some of her friends who spoke Spanish. On top of all this, the FBI says David rented a car in Serbia and returned it with almost 5,000 more miles on it and tinted windows. Spanish authorities say they saw a similar vehicle with stolen license plates in the area of Anna's disappearance, but they couldn't determine who the driver was because of these tinted windows. The feds now believe David carried Anna's body out of her Madrid apartment in a suitcase. There's even security video of him exiting the elevator. After that, they believe David put her body in the woods somewhere in northern Italy because the GPS on David's rental car says it traveled there before returning back to Serbia from Spain. But so far, Anna's body has not been found. Things look pretty suspicious for David after her disappearance, but it took 3 months until we saw more movement in the case. He was finally arrested in May when he landed at the Miami airport after arriving back in the US. At that point, he was only charged with Anna's kidnapping. It was the FBI that made the announcement of David's arrest for, quote, his alleged involvement in the kidnapping of a U.S. citizen in Madrid, Spain on or about February 2nd, 2024. For the federal kidnapping charge, David pleaded not guilty but was held without bond because a magistrate judge ruled he was a major flight risk. Just this week, he was indicted by a federal grand jury, and he's now facing 3 new and more severe charges, including kidnapping resulting in death, domestic violence resulting in death, and foreign murder of a United States national. The superseding indictment doesn't give many more details than that, except that David could now face the death penalty if he's convicted. So to better understand this case and what it all means for David Knezevich, we've got to turn to former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani. Nima, it's always great when you're on with us. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me, Sierra.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you specifically today is because you have a history as a federal prosecutor, and obviously the case is a federal one. My question, and I'm sure the question for anyone following this case, is what took so long? Why now was he charged with murder when there isn't seemingly any new evidence?
Well, it's challenging when you're dealing with federal murder cases. Obviously, if there's an act of terrorism or something on a federal base or a federal building, then it ends up being a federal crime. But when you're dealing with these murders abroad, murders of U.S. citizens, they can be challenging cases because, of course, you don't have the FBI working in Spain or other countries in the world. You don't have the law enforcement presence that we have here in the United States, both local, state, and federal. So you really have to rely on police officers and diplomacy in other countries to get the evidence that you need to pursue a case like this.
So I took a look at the superseding indictment, and honestly, it seemed a little bare to me. The criminal complaints from a couple months ago had a few more details, but this new paperwork doesn't really seem to have much. So is it possible that they have some more info, they're just not letting us know about it?
I think so. Sometimes you'll have a speaking indictment that has lots of information. Sometimes it'll even have pictures in the indictment. That's an indictment for public consumption. Oftentimes you'll have a bare bones indictment like this, and any evidence that prosecutors have, they have to provide it during discovery to the defense. But we're not going to know what it is until the trial starts.
So let's talk about the charges now. They seem to make sense to me. I mean, count 1, kidnapping resulting in death, count 2, domestic violence resulting in death, and then count 3, foreign murder of a United States national. Obviously, this happened overseas and she was an American. So do you think that those charges all make sense? Do you think the prosecution has enough evidence to bring these?
I think so. Obviously, the murder speaks for itself, but apparently you have this history of violence, domestic violence, and when you have duct tape and, individuals being restrained and moved, that's kidnapping. Really, the only question in this case is obviously we're going to have a new president and a new attorney general soon. And is this case going to be a potential death penalty case? Because obviously the death penalty is a possibility under federal law, or is this just a type of case that will be life without the possibility of parole?
I'm glad that you brought that up, the potential of death penalty, because one thing that was in this new indictment was the potential sentences. One was life, and then the others could be death, which is a huge thing to undertake. I mean, for prosecutors, I'm sure they really have to go over it, think it through. What do you think would be going through their brains, whether they're going to pursue this death penalty?
When it comes to the death penalty, and really any jurisdiction, it's really up to the head prosecutor. So oftentimes that'll be the district attorney or the county attorney that's ultimately making that decision. Here, it's going to go all the way up to DC, the attorney general or the number two of the Department of Justice, the individual in charge of the criminal division. These are decisions made at the highest level. I believe under federal law, the Attorney General does have to personally sign off on the death penalty. So obviously, that's currently Merrick Garland. We know that there's a nominee for Attorney General, Matt Gaetz. Let's see if he's going to be confirmed. But I mean, these are decisions that really go to the highest level individual, because obviously we're talking about death penalty. That really creates two trials, a guilt phase and a penalty phase. And if not, going back to what I was saying, really, there's no real possibility for supervised release in murder cases under federal law. So either it's going to be a life in prison type case or the potential death penalty. So it'll be interesting to see what the Attorney General decides here.
Yeah, that's something we'll definitely want to keep an eye on which way they kind of decide to go. But as far as evidence in the case, there kind of seems to be an overwhelming amount of incriminating evidence against David Knezevich. I mean, the list could go on and on. There's a person who looks a lot like him on security camera video, spray painting it right around Anna's apartment. Or the car he rented suddenly ended up with tinted windows. I mean, those things are pretty incriminating to me. There's a long list, but a lot of them are circumstantial. So does that work in the defense's favor?
I think circumstantial evidence, if you're the prosecutor and you just have bits and pieces, it can be challenging. But when you have a lot of circumstantial evidence like you have here, I think it ends up being a strong case. So, I mean, you touched upon some of it, right? We've all seen the video of what appears to be David, the defendant, buying the spray paint, the duct tape. Obviously, the video of him spray painting the cameras, the tinted windows, the license plates being swapped out, the text messages. So some of it's the crime, but some of it's the cover up as well. And if jurors believe that it was indeed David in these videos, I think they won't have a difficult time convicting him for the murder of Anna.
That's a good point because there is a lot of evidence here, but there's an interesting aspect to all of this too, because David pleaded not guilty to all this. And as far as like DNA or any evidence like that, in Anna's apartment, there was no blood found. There was no sign of forced entry. Actually, to go inside, it was firefighters who had to break down the door and get in. So it looked kind of like a clean area, but prosecutors believe that she could have been killed there. So in that case, does that work for David's defense?
Well, it does work for his defense, and to the extent that there isn't that evidence that you would expect in a crime scene, blood and that type of thing. Now, obviously, not every murder results in blood. You could have strangulation, you could have other types of murder that wouldn't necessarily create a bloody scene. But I mean, that's what people who are watching Law and Crime expect, right? We've seen so many of these trials where you have the forensic experts, they come in, they find the DNA, and they find the blood, and you have that type of evidence. So if you don't have that, if you're the prosecution, you're going to want some sort of explanation for jurors who are hearing the case.
So we've talked about evidence on both sides that helps the prosecution and then potentially the defense, but there's also motive. And obviously we know you don't need motive to convict someone of murder, but in this case, I feel like prosecutors could paint a pretty good picture with the motive. It seems that they were going through a divorce, they were estranged at the time, and he had just made a bunch of sales, $6 million worth, potentially didn't want to split up the money. Do you think that motive is a win for prosecutors?
I think so. And like you said, motive isn't an element of the case, but jurors are going to ask, why would someone kill another human being? And we know, watching so much Law and Crime, that oftentimes it is the spouse, it is the boyfriend, that is the primary suspect, especially when you're going through a separation or a divorce. And when you add a potential financial motive on top of it, it was selling and liquidating some of his properties, that may have been enough. Because oftentimes when there's a murder, it's someone it's not a random act by a stranger.
You brought up the jury a couple times, so I kind of want to touch on that because David was just indicted based on a grand jury this week. What would those proceedings have looked like? I know that there are closed doors behind them. We don't know that much about it, but what could it have looked like?
So it's a secret proceeding, and in that grand jury room, there's just the prosecutor, a court reporter, and the grand jurors. The defense isn't present, and that's why grand juries almost always indict. I put more than 1,000 people in prison. I never once had a grand jury not indict or return a no bill. So the grand jurors, they know the prosecutor. They really hear a one-sided account of the evidence, and that's why it's very, very easy to get a grand jury indictment. And unlike the trial jury that has to be unanimous, the grand jurors just need to return a true bill by a simple majority. So when I was indicting cases, that would just be 12 out of 23 jurors. So it's pretty easy to get an indictment. But grand juries really have two roles. First is to investigate the case. They can issue subpoenas. They can do things like that. Unclear how effective that would be overseas to get information. We'd probably need cooperation from Spanish authorities, but they can also charge people for felonies, and that's what happened here.
You brought up something really important too, the fact that this alleged crime did not happen on United States soil. So we have the Spanish authorities over there. Also, there was potentially Italian authorities that were involved based on a search for Anna's body. David Knezevich was apparently in Serbia. A lot of different countries that are going on and being involved in this. Does that make things all the more complicated to communicate, get information, and make sure the prosecutors know everything that the other authorities have?
Sierra, it does, and we've seen these types of murders in federal cases where someone kills their spouse overseas. They're both U.S. citizens, or the victim is a U.S. citizen, and it takes a long time to investigate and prosecute these cases because we're really relying on information being provided to us by law enforcement in another country, and they do things differently. There might be not just the Department of Justice and their equivalent in the other country, the State Department may have to get involved. Obviously, things can get lost in translation to the extent that investigations are being conducted in other languages. So it's not easy to investigate a case in one country and prosecute it in another.
That kind of gets me thinking. I was talking with one of our lawandcrime.com reporters. He was also covering the case. And he was saying, why wasn't this prosecuted over in Spain if that's where the alleged crime happened and it's being over here? Do you have any idea about that?
Well, it's being prosecuted here because we're talking about a U.S. citizen killed by, another American. So that does make it uh, a federal crime, and there's a jurisdictional hook. Murder of a U.S. citizen overseas or foreign murder. Obviously, if two Spaniards had killed each other, that would be tragic, but that would not be a U.S. case. So the way that the countries view these types of cases, well, look, if there is, a nexus or a reason for the case to be handled here in the United States, then oftentimes they'll agree to that. And especially in this case, because there was no extradition here, right? David was arrested at Miami's airport, so he was already here. Sometimes countries won't extradite to the United States if it's a potential death penalty case, because in the sending country, let's say Spain, they may not have the death penalty. There may be some resistance. But in this particular case, the defendant was already arrested here in the United States, so he's already here, and there's no reason not to try him here.
Talking about David's arrest, that was kind of interesting to me because he was overseas at the time of Anna's murder, obviously. He says he was in one place in Serbia, it happened in Spain. All of that remains to be seen, but we know that he was over in Europe. And then we also know that her death or disappearance was being investigated, but he still willingly chose to fly back to the United States, even though he knew the FBI and American prosecutors, investigators were all kind of looking into it. Why do you think he would have come back over here?
Well, a couple reasons. One, he was overly confident. Two, he didn't know that he was really being investigated or under indictment or would have been arrested. Obviously, so much time had passed that maybe he thought that this was all behind him and he wasn't a suspect. In hindsight, that was a mistake. Obviously, most people do not willingly come to the United States when they have an arrest warrant. Sometimes they're duped to come in. And we've seen law enforcement successfully convince people to either come to the United States, which is the best case scenario of all, or leave a non-extradition country to go to an extradition country where they can be arrested and brought to the United States. So tough to know what's going on through David's head, but as far as prosecutors are concerned, it's really the best case scenario to arrest him when he's on U.S. soil, so you don't have to deal with the whole extradition process.
And you talked about David Knezevich's confidence, which leads into my next question. He pleaded not guilty in this case. So I'm wondering about the defense. What do you think his team would bring forth to explain all this away?
I think they're going to have to argue that it wasn't me, right? I don't think it's going to be, well, this was an accident and something happened, right? I mean, he's going to have to argue that he has an alibi, he wasn't there, with some other individual that was the person who spray painted and duct tape and appeared in all the videos that we've seen. It's going to be a challenge, but certainly I think that's the direction the defense has to go in. This isn't the type of case that prosecutors are going to give any type of deal. It's a murder case. You're not going to give a discount on a case like this when someone uh, allegedly engages in first degree premeditated murder, right? This wasn't uh, a manslaughter case, a fit of rage, or even, something that went too far. This is someone who plotted and planned to kill Anna. So I think it's going to be a life case, and that's the only possible deal that will be on the table at best for him to take the death penalty off the table. That's why I can see this case going to trial.
And talking about his defense, they have wanted him released since his arrest, really, on bond, but the judge is saying he's a huge flight risk. I think that may be valid given that he lived overseas for some time. What do you think about that? Do you think that the defense could ever pull that off, that he could be released on bond or bail?
No way, Sierra. Bond is appropriate if someone is neither a risk of flight nor a danger to the community. And someone that kills their wife or their ex-wife in this type of fashion, plotting and planning, that premeditation, and someone that has ties all over Europe and can easily hop on a plane and disappear, this is not someone that will ever be granted bond under our federal system or in any court in this country.
We've talked about the timeline in this case because Anna went missing in February. I mean, it's November now. It's almost nearing a year. We've seen movement in the case, obviously, but it's been slow. What do you think is next for prosecutors and investigators? Would they still be gathering evidence, kind of bulking up their case?
I think things are going to start moving quickly now because we know the defendant has a right to a speedy trial. Now, obviously, he can waive that right, but if he doesn't, we got to go to trial in a matter of months. So when prosecutors indict a case like this, they always have to be prepared for the possibility that the defendant says, you know, I'm going to assert my right. I'm going to jam you up, and you better be ready to try your case. So I would expect things to move pretty quickly. Now, of course, if the defense needs time to conduct their own investigation and review all the evidence, that's one thing. But you don't indict a case like this unless you're ready to go all the way if necessary.
This is definitely one we've been following and will continue to follow to see what shakes out as far as David Knezevich. But Nima, thank you for talking to us today. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and you really broke down a lot for us.
Always great to be on, Sierra. Thanks for having me.
David is due back in court next week for his arraignment. His attorneys say he maintains his innocence and is planning to plead not guilty. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.